Hello, I'm the Grub Street Lodger, and I just thought I'd make a video talking about something I've seen recently. It's on Disney Plus, and it's called Renegade Nell, and it tells the story of a woman with fairy-assisted superhuman powers who fights a demonic cabal of Jacobites. So it's not a very strict historical telling. However, it is set in the 18th century, in the early 18th century, under the reign of Queen Anne, and as peculiar and sort of cartoony as most of it is, there is some interesting bits of history around it. So I want to have a little talk about those, particularly the truly bizarre way that Grub Street is depicted. I thought it would be a bit of fun. But I'm going to go to an earlier episode first. They go to Newgate Jail, and there's some good research that informs this. So Newgate Jail was a jail, but you had to pay to stay there. And if you couldn't pay, you were put in the hole, which was just the rankest bit. And the more you paid, the better quarters you got. And in fact, some of the most expensive rooms to rent in London were the cells of Newgate Jail. And so there's a character who has a rich patroness who's managed to pay for a nice suite for him in Newgate Jail, where the turnkeys make a bit of extra money by displaying him to the gentry and letting them peek in and see him, which is another thing that really happened. And I thought that was quite interesting, having the history of the celebrity prisoners being on show. Got some notes here, and there's a fun part where there's a character called Rasselas, which again, as a Johnson fanatic, is gonna jump out at me because Rasselas is the name of Johnson's novel. Though Johnson's novel came out in 1742, this is set in the 1710s. But hey, that's kind of fun. Even though Rasselas isn't his real name, he was he's a slave who's become a servant, a little bit like Francis Barber, and he finds his real name later on. But yeah, so Rasselas is in the coffee house, and there's a joke where somebody comes in and goes, "Is there a doctor?" And everybody in the coffee house will goes, "Yes, I'm a doctor. I'm a doctor. I'm a doctor." And that's, again, a good bit of research, because the coffee houses, there were some that were general, but a lot of them were specific to different businesses and different trades. And in fact, some coffee houses, like Lloyd's Coffee House, which was attended by marine insurance people and such, became a separate business but stemmed out of the coffee house. So this is obviously a doctor's coffee house, which, if I remember right, was called Slaughter's Coffee House and was near St. Bart's Hospital. The doctor's one, but I might not be remembering that quite right. Now, the coffee house itself isn't exactly the way an early 18th coffee house would be, because it's all got booths and it's more like a little pub or a modern sort of coffee shop, whereas 18th century coffee house would have a big long table down the middle and everyone would sit at the same table because it was a communal space. And the coffee house also subscribed to all the newspapers and journals and bought broadsheets and penny dreadfuls and all sorts of things, and spread them all down the table, and they'd all be read and discussed. And you paid on entry, and then you could stay there for a few hours. People used it as an office. Christopher Smart essentially used a coffee house as his office, because you'd pay a couple of quid, you'd sit there drinking coffee, and you had all the news available to you and people to talk to about it and stuff. But still, I thought that was fun. Now, the way newspapers and the news are depicted in this is what I really wanted to go with, because there's a highwayman and his fiancée, whose name I've forgotten. She had a really ridiculous name, but she's sort of the doyenne of print, which actually that's quite fair. There were an awful lot of women printers and things, and they often traded under their husband's name. Either because the husband was alive, but they worked in it as well. You get that with various printers, or because the husbands died, but the woman carried on just under their husband's name. So there were a lot of women printers and publishers and booksellers involved in Grub Street. But in this, she's like the owner of all the newspapers, and it's really funny the way they do this. So there's an episode all about print and newspaper and reputation and lies. So essentially in this, each episode is about some form of injustice in the early 18th century, which is fought by our hero Renegade Nell. And in this, she wants to fight the press. And in the little description on the Disney thing, it says she goes to Fleet Street. And what's funny is, in Britain, Fleet Street is synonymous with newspapers, even though no newspapers are printed there anymore. And I don't think there's even any offices for newspapers there anymore. The last ones have moved out. But in, colloquial British, Fleet Street is our name for the press. However, at this point, that was not the case. There wasn't a name for the press, but there was a name for writers for hire who would write for the press, and that name is Grub Street. And Grub Street were all the hack writers who could get paid to write ephemeral stuff and arguments and all sorts of things like this. And so to call it Fleet Street is anachronistic. But hey, as I say, this is it's a silly fantasy thing. But also interestingly, of course, is despite the fact that Grub Street was the name given to all these hack writers and things, there were very few on Grub Street itself. Tourists used to go to Grub Street and be disappointed because there wasn't any writers on it. In fact, a lot of them lived on and around Fleet Street because so Caxton set up a printing press in Westminster, but the first printing press in London was set up on Fleet Street by St Bride's Church by a man called Wynkyn de Worde, which is a fantastic name. And St Paul's Cathedral and a little street around there called Little Britain, they were the hub of the book trade. And so all the writers, many of them did live in and around Fleet Street. Johnson has about 4 or 5 different addresses just off Fleet Street, and the current Dr. Johnson's house, Gough Square, is a square just off Fleet Street. So the name Fleet Street for newspapers didn't exist, but they did all live off Fleet Street. It's a bit weird. But they go into this place, and it's a huge headquarters. And at the front of it is a depiction of the woman and the name of all the newspapers she owns. And it's a fun little 18th century Easter egg, I suppose, because all the newspapers like the Daily Courant and the Mercury and the Flying Post, which was known as the Lying Post, are all listed there as if she owns them all, which, of course, is not what happened. And then she goes into this big room, and it's this huge, beautiful, opulent space with all this stripy wallpaper, and the prints are in there with the journalists writing away, and it's completely ridiculous. It's like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Of course, with Grub Street, what happened was that the writers sometimes did live in the houses of their employers or houses provided by their employers, and they wrote and wrote and wrote, and the employers had very small offices and the printers had a different premises. So, for example, Samuel Johnson, he wrote for the very first magazine. It was called the Gentleman's Magazine, and he lived in all sorts of various little addresses and garrets and attics and crappy places, and he wrote. He had a little office above St. John's Gate, which is a gatehouse for a defunct medieval priory, which was their head offices, and then various other printers all over the place would print it. And so, yeah, this is ridiculous, but it's kind of a fun ridiculous. And there's another little 18th century Easter egg, that there's an editor, and editors didn't quite exist. So Samuel Johnson was kind of an editor for the Gentleman's Magazine. He sort of went over all the submissions to him and did them up. He wrote his own pieces, and he ran the competitions, or he judged the competitions. In fact, he was really bad at judging the competitions, so much so there were complaints that the competitions weren't happening quickly enough. These were poetry competitions. But so he was sort of like an editor, but this has a full-on proper editor who has an editor's suite. It's played by Mark Heap, who for me will always be Brian from Spaced. And it's only a little glimpse, but above his door of his office is the word Sylvanus Urban. And that's the pen name of Edward Cave. I've got this book here called Booksellers in the Time of Dr. Johnson. And Edward Cave, he wasn't really a bookseller. Here's the real man. But he was the founder of the Gentleman's Magazine that Samuel Johnson worked on. And so his pen name was Sylvanus Urban. And that was a fun little hint there. And I just love the fact that they have this huge fantasy newspaper office. There wasn't there were people who made a lot of money and influence out of book selling and out of selling newspapers and various other things like that. But there wasn't a what's his name? Australian man, owns everything, owns Sky. Oh, I gotta even look it up. Yeah, Rupert Murdoch. There wasn't a Rupert Murdoch figure exactly. One of the closest I can think to that is a man called John Dunton, whose sort of memoirs are really funny because he's trying to say that he was such a good, noble man when he was a bit of a scoundrel. He founded this thing called the Athenaeum Society, who had the Athenaeum Society newspaper, and then later they had their own female offshoot called the Female Athenaeum. And the idea of this was that there was a council of learned people who wrote articles. And there was also the very first sort of agony aunt column in this. So people would write in asking for advice on things, and the panel of experts would answer. Of course, there was no panel of experts. It was all John Dunton. But in owning a few different ones, he is the closest to that kind of figure. Generally, people would either write their own one. So Samuel Johnson just wrote his own little newspaper thing called The Rambler, which are my favourite of his writings. Or there'd be someone like Christopher Smart who wrote his own ones called The Midwife, but it was sold and organised through his father-in-law, who was John Newbery, who the Newbery Prize is named after. So John Newbery might have owned several different sort of organs, but it's still not quite the same. Anyway, I only wanted to mention it because I watched it and I was like, oh, Grub Street's being addressed. It's been addressed in a very strange way, but it's here. And the beginning of that episode has a musical montage. And the musical montage starts with a ballad singer, and they're singing the ballad of Renegade Nell, and then everybody sings it. And it's a bit like Who Will Buy from Oliver. And it's interesting because the key ways of distributing news were, letting out leaflets and pamphlets, and having those leaflets and pamphlets in coffee houses. So I almost think of coffee houses as like web forums, and the leaflets and pamphlets as videos or tweets or posts. And so they'd all go to the coffee house, the web forum, and discuss it. But the other way, the way usually poorer people heard the news, was through ballad singers, and they'd go out on the street and they'd sing the ballad, and then they'd sell the words, and pubs would like stick them up on their wall for people to have a look at, and people would buy them or collect them, or some of them would end up in coffee houses. And so it does start with a pretty accurate depiction of how news travelled around London in the 18th century through song and ballad, and then it goes through coffee houses and things. Anyway, I mean, the series itself it's okay. It's kind of fun, ephemeral, a fairy-powered highwaywoman who fights demonic Jacobites. So I mean, it's not any great work of art, I suppose, but it's a good fun series. And I liked how those little Easter eggs for the 18th century hunter were in there. And being one, I wanted to share the ones I've seen. If you saw any other little details like that, put them in the comments. Thanks.